Lee's introduced this as part of the Neurodiversity Celebration Week. So just to sort of give an overview of our aims of the session today. So I'm going to be talking about what is neurodiversity. So what do we mean by that? How common is it? How it may present in the workplace, employer responsibilities, and adjustments that may be of benefit for different types of neurodiversity. I should say at the outset, I'm not an expert in neurodiversity. I'm a clinical psychologist. My background is in mental health, but I've worked in occupational health for the past 12 years. So what I'm sharing with you today are very much my findings about this subject with you. So yeah, just to kind of make that clear. Okay, then, so what do we mean by neurodiversity? So basically, neurodiversity refers to diversity in the human brain and cognition. So, for example, instances of sociability, learning, attention, mood, and other mental functions. The term itself was coined in the 1980s by a sociologist, an Australian sociologist by the name of Judy Singer. And it's an umbrella term for a range of hidden neurological differences. So these include dyslexia, dyspraxia, which is also called developmental coordination disorder or DCD, dyscalculia, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, autistic spectrum condition or autistic spectrum disorder, so known as ASC or ASD, and Tourette's syndrome. So as the graphic on the right shows, lots of these conditions can sort of co-occur, they overlap, many of the symptoms might overlap. And alongside that can also go some, hand in hand with that can go with some comorbid mental health conditions as well, such as social anxiety. So another point I want to make is that, you know, there's increasing recognition, and again, in line with this week's celebration, these conditions are increasingly being recognized as part of kind of normal or natural human variation. So rather than being viewed as sort of pathological or a disease, like an illness model, it's noted as kind of part of normal, natural human variation. And there's increasing recognition of individuals with neurodiversity having associated strengths, and these contributions are now starting to be appreciated. So it's kind of making reference really to what we know as the social model of disability, where disability arises out of societal barriers, interacting with individual difference, as opposed to people simply being disabled as a result of having impairments. And I think it's fair to say as well, I just want to make the point that many individuals with neurodiverse conditions may not identify themselves as having a disability, but instead view it as part of their identity. So it's also important to recognise and acknowledge that not everybody with a neurodiverse condition will be the same. So, for example, you know, you might have one person with ADHD and another person with ADHD. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be affected in the same way. I also want to point out that whilst, we're trying to sort of strike a balance here, trying to, promote adjustments and acceptance and celebrate this neurodiversity and the many strengths and contributions that can bring. For some individuals, they may be on the surface look like that they're kind of managing and coping well, but for others, they may not be doing so. So there is a need to think about adjustments and try to help people to be that sort of have the best fit with their workplace that they can possibly have. Okay, so moving on. So in terms of what is the incidence then of neurodiversity? So as it says on the slide here, so 10%, so the BDA, British Dyslexia Association, associate 10% of the population as being affected. But there are some organisations that have greater incidence. So there was a study done by Cambridge Uni in 2015, which found that people working in science and engineering jobs were much more likely to have autistic-like traits than less technical professions. So if you think about the workplace, typically workplaces are sort of geared up and they're set up to suit what we call neurotypical individuals. So, neurodivergent individuals can be overlooked through a lack of understanding in the workplace. So it's important that we think about and support businesses and companies and employers think about how to best support that individual. And this, again, about this best fit between the person and the role and the place of employment. So rather than trying to get the individual to fit with the role, it's also about how to kind of come at it from the other end. How can we arrange the workplace and the work in question to draw on those strengths and make the best fit for the individual? And of course, part of that then is about employers ensuring that there's an understanding of what neurodiversity is, and that managers within each of those businesses have the developed skills to lead and manage neurodiverse staff. And I guess the fact that you're all signed up and attending this webinar today is evidence of wanting to improve that or to add to that or just refresh your knowledge on the matter already. And alongside that, then thinking about what some of those reasonable adjustments might be to help to support neurodivergent people in the workforce. And again, knowing who to contact for help and thinking about how to promote and maintain a friendly workplace for people with these conditions. Okay, so how do we know if someone's got neurodiversity? Well, basically, it's not always clear because they are hidden conditions. A lot of this would not be visible. So unless an employee or a job applicant for a new post actually discloses that, on a kind of pre-employment, and actually that's substantiated, so via medical evidence, there is no certainty about that. Diversity can amount to a disability under the Equality Act. And what we can say is that although these are without medical evidence, if you've got an employee that's been on the workforce and you know them well, and over a number of years you've noted certain behaviours or maybe certain difficulties, the employer then can be sort of described to have what we call constructive knowledge of that disability. So you're judging that from the behaviours. Obviously, the fact that we're celebrating this today and putting this webinar on, is indicative of a greater awareness in society in general about neurodiversity, which has got to be a good thing. It's a very positive thing. There's lots of, even more in the last kind of couple of months, the last years or whatever, more kind of famous people or celebrities, much more, breaking down stigma and actually sharing knowledge of diagnoses of different people and putting that much more into the public domain. So that's a helpful thing. Increasingly, there's also this kind of late diagnosis of neurodivergence in adults. And that can sometimes be when, parents, maybe they've got a child and they've got some difficulty. So often when one's child or kids are diagnosed with something, because there is, for not all conditions, but for some conditions, there is a genetic component, it can then cause the parent, quite understandably, to sort of think, well, maybe the apple doesn't fall far from the tree here. So maybe to look at themselves and to think about them, if they've got some similar difficulties, and it might lend them to then seeking their own assessment and diagnosis as well. So I'm just thinking then, interested if you know of any people who have got a neurodivergent condition. So I've updated this slide quite recently. I'm not going to read them all out to you. You're capable of looking at this and going through the list yourselves. And what you can see against some of these names, there's that co-occurrence of conditions. So there's quite a few individuals here that maybe have just not got one condition, but maybe a couple of neurodiverse aspects. And whilst you're going through the list, I'm going to share a couple of comments made about a few of the individuals or some of the more sort of eminent individuals from their school days. So in terms of the first one I'm going to look at is Alan Turing. So he was viewed obviously as one of the most sort of creative mathematicians of the 20th century. He assisted with shortening World War II by 2 years and saved 14 million lives by figuring out the Enigma code. He was likewise very eminent for his work encompassing artificial intelligence and making the Turing test. However, in school, he was described as antisocial and considered to be wasting the time of his teachers due to his passion for science and disinterest in studying the classics, which were considered to be essential. Another comment about Albert Einstein in this case. So again, you know, we'd all accept him as being perhaps the best mastermind of the 20th century. And even though it's unproven, there's lots of indicators to propose that Einstein might have had dyslexia. He famously had problems with spelling and grammar, excelling in maths and science instead. He experienced delayed speech, or not speaking comfortably until he was 6 years old. And many said that he continued to experience difficulty when reading aloud. And then perhaps as a more current example, so despite being considered incapable of learning when he was at school, Bill Gates obviously went on to establish Microsoft, who's now one of the biggest and most innovative organizations on the planet. So hopefully through sort of just those examples there kind of help to see the attraction of having such like-minded and skilled people on, you know, as part of anybody's work team. Okay, so thinking then about how neurodiversity may affect employees at work. So as it's in bold here, you know, basically, the kind of the wiring, if you like, the wiring is different. So neurodiverse individuals experience the world differently. So unlike a physical disability, so, you know, which is visible. So for example, you know, if you had somebody that had a mobility problem, perhaps they're a wheelchair user, you know, you wouldn't expect them to use the stairs because that's visible. You can see that. Many of the barriers that people with neurodiversity face are invisible. So it's not my intention to describe the difficulties associated with every single type of neurodiverse condition, but instead, for the talk today, I'm just going to think a little bit about autism. So, you know, for autism, due to the nature of autism, individuals will have, and this is part of the diagnosis, we're likely to have difficulty with processing sensory stimulation. So this is like having a heightened sensitivity to different stimulation. And the potential then to be overstimulated, which the closest thing I can describe it to is that that's like a pain, it's a distress, it's an extreme discomfort for that individual. That can lead to what is known as overload and the term autistic meltdown. So we need to think about, you know, because this is extremely distressing and really painful for the individual. So we think in the workplace, we need to think about some of the sensory barriers or triggers in the workplace. So I just invite you to think about in your own workplaces, think about the noise, think about lighting, think about smells, textures, temperatures, etc. All of those things are, you know, potentially an assault on somebody with autism in terms of their sensory system. Excuse me. Another barrier or another thing we need to consider would be with regards to communication and sort of some of the social challenges, so social behaviour. So again, part of the diagnosis, one of the criteria to be diagnosed with autism is about understanding social behaviour and sort of reading sort of social signs, understanding the rules of that in interaction. So if you think about, again, think about the workplace, you think about how much of our communication on a day-to-day basis, you know, we can use quite ambiguous language, you know, we have indirect communication, we tend to use metaphors, and there's a lot of what we communicate is via body language, facial expression, etc. Those things are going to be typically more difficult for somebody with autism to manage. Individuals, I'm talking about autism here, but this can apply to lots of the neurodiverse conditions. So individuals can then try to what's termed as masking. So it's about camouflaging those traits and sort of trying to hide some of those difficulties. So to appear like they fit in with the neurotypical workplace, neurotypical colleagues. But the effort of doing that, of masking that behavior, masking some of the things they would ordinarily feel more comfortable to do to manage those symptoms, is really exhausting and can take and have a big toll on somebody's mental health. It can lead to burnout in their profession and in their workplace, and unfortunately in some cases actually lead to suicide. So again, just to really be kind of aware of that. And again, because I'm talking about autism, I'm going to mention the use of what's known as stimming behaviours. So stimming is sort of shortened version for self-stimulatory behaviour. The scientific term is stereotypy. So this is where an individual may engage with, repetition of physical movement, sounds, words, might be moving objects or other repetitive behaviours. And it's recognised and understood as a protective response to that overstimulation. So when I talked about those sensory barriers, it's a way of the person with autism trying to block out and to manage that kind of overload. So it can be sort of viewed as a coping mechanism to kind of manage that or other heightened and negative emotions. So it can look odd, to a neurotypical colleagues, neurotypical kind of workforce, that can look odd, but it's, at least if we understand what the function is kind of a clue that somebody's not coping, and we need to kind of think about what we need to put in place to kind of maybe lower that and to kind of help that. Okay. I think this is quite a useful graphic to look at. So in terms of understanding different sort of skills in people, a neurodiverse individual would typically have what we, as a psychologist, we would call a spiky profile. So this is how, an average Joe, so for myself, for example, the blue line on this graphic, those are those are points which are plotted in regard to, different cognitive abilities. It might be attention, it might be memory, it might be, processing speed, it might be problem solving, executive function, ability to, manage language, ability to manage numbers, forward planning, those types of things. So a neurotypical person, there will be, obviously we're all individuals, and there will be kind of some individuals that will have, might be slightly better at one thing than another, but generally, as a rule of thumb, we would have a fairly flattish profile. So we'd be on the blue line, which, so, a bit better at some things, but not so good at others, but fairly sort of flattish line. Somebody with neurodiversity would have, far higher peaks and troughs. So they would be very good, much better than a neurotypical person for some of those particular cognitive abilities, and others they would be a lot lower on. So it's just a good way to kind of think about that in terms of a strengths and weaknesses kind of basis, really. And obviously we're trying to harness people's strengths here. So I think this is a nice graphic, a nice slide to show in terms of the benefits of neurodiversity associated with different conditions. So I'm not going to read them all out. You can look at that and consider that in your own time. But I think it gives a nice sort of overview and how they kind of differ. Some, you can see there's overlap. So certain things are strengths in different conditions. Others are quite unique to particular types of neurodiversity. Okay. So again, thinking about, harnessing those benefits, if we've got people that have got, a higher skills and a greater ability at certain things, it is about trying to make our workplaces and our work cultures far more inclusive. So, if we recognise, as I said at the beginning, about neurodiversity being part of natural human variation and having an appreciation of those strengths, what we're trying to do, as I said, is rather than try to change the workplace, it's about how to best support the individual to fit as well as possible within the workplace. And many large employers are now embracing neurodiversity. This is particularly notable in the intelligence services and the corporate world, so where specific neurodiversity and autism hiring programs are becoming increasingly common. So due to that recognition that diversity in a team is really advantageous, and it can actually bring about a competitive edge. So because of those different cognitive abilities. And of course, I mean, if you know, as genuinely, if we're doing this, you know, genuinely and you know, wholeheartedly, you know, that's being a more what am I trying to say, being a more inclusive employer and how you know, rewarding and accepting and acknowledging diversity. That's a good thing. That's a good culture to have in a company. So, you know, if we've got that in place, then the benefits, you know, hardly need to kind of highlight them really, but if you're going to more likely lend itself to greater employee engagement, empowerment, you know, it's going to be things like better staff retention, less turnover, better productivity. You know, there's going to be lots of advantages that come from that as a follow-on. Okay, so I'm going to show this, share this clip with you now from YouTube. So it is written by, it's been put on by HSBC Bank. But again, just in terms of thinking about some of those advantages.
Were to say to me, wow, you're really good at thinking about concepts, for example. The equivalent of that for me would be to say to a person, wow, you're really good at breathing.
People think that you're thick.
They think that I can't read.
That we're dumb, that we're slow, we're uneducated. Actually, it's quite the opposite.
I'm neurodiverse because I am autistic.
I have something that's called Asperger's syndrome, which is an autistic spectrum disorder.
I'm dyslexic.
I have Asperger's syndrome.
I'm dyslexic and I also have dysgraphia.
I have dyslexia and dyscalculia.
I got an ADHD diagnosis a few years ago, and it was actually the first time in my life that I made sense to myself.
I just think it's the way my brain's wired up.
Just wired differently.
I am not seeing what everyone else is seeing. There's obviously a huge advantage to that, but we've only learned to appreciate this potential over the last few years.
One way of understanding neurodiversity is if we've got people who we call normal, we call them neurotypical, they can see the visual spectrum of colours going from red to indigo. Neurodiverse people, they might not be able to see blue, but they can see in infrared. Now you've got somebody in your team who can see in the dark. Do you want to have that person in your team? Of course you do.
Many of my strengths, I believe, come from my autism.
I'm good at retaining knowledge. I know where to find the knowledge.
My brain is incredibly logical. One of my main traits is I can take lots of different sort of level 2D drawings and then make them into a 3D model in my head and be able to spin them around.
I'm very good at spatial things. I built a kitchen in our house 12 years ago, bought all the bits from IKEA and fitted the whole thing. And somebody said to me, well, where did you make a plan that? I didn't. I did it all in my head.
So ADHD is basically like watching 30 different channels at the same time and somebody else is holding the remote control. I am calm in situations where a lot of other people get really anxious. There's limited fear to actually make a decision, which I sometimes find very helpful in business context, because sometimes we just have to decide something to be able to move ahead.
I can hold very large, very complex systems in mind.
The way I look at the world is black and white. It's not the grey areas in between. I can think logically, I can think straight down the middle, and it brings the team in together so that it's not going round and round in circles.
I think one of the biggest challenges for me is that neurological differences are invisible. Don't assume everyone else, just because they look like you or they have a similar job or that they think in the exact same way.
I would say definitely don't be afraid to talk about it.
For me, I would say speak to your managers and let them be aware. And I think by doing that, it makes you more confident and more freer.
It's not something that all of us are easy talking about, but the more we do talk about it, the more people understand and will appreciate the different abilities and the different gifts that neurodivergent people can actually bring to HSBC.
Okay, so hopefully that YouTube clip, I think it's really positive, and hopefully you share the same opinion and found some benefit from seeing that. Okay, so to move on then and to think about employer responsibilities within the workplace. It's probably the most important thing you can do to support staff, neurodivergent staff in the workplace, is to ensure that line managers are skilled and knowledgeable about inclusion. This includes making sure they're supported to explore options to retain staff, as well as access to training for themselves as managers. To ensure that staff with disabilities or neurodiversity have equal access to training and professional development and can themselves progress onto management roles. Also about sharing and celebrating your success in diverse recruitment processes and the retention and progression of such staff, so that these precedents can be drawn on to improve staff experience. And then obviously evaluating and learning from that experience, so both good and bad. Ideally setting up and supporting the development of a staff network. So for neurodivergent staff, this can very much help amplify the voice of such individuals, and it can be taken on and recognised and used by the organisation. And there should be a mechanism to allow neurodivergent staff to influence policies and processes to ensure full inclusivity. So, having sort of, user experience and being part of that design of policies and processes, etc. So again, that staff network is one way in which to achieve that. So we're going to move on to consider reasonable adjustments then in the workplace. So, I mean, I'm sure most of you are already aware, but the idea, the sort of concept of reasonable adjustments is a legal definition, not a medical definition. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, many neurodivergent individuals may not identify themselves as being disabled. However, they would still be protected by this legislation. So it's under the Equality Act 2010, and positive benefits of treatment are not considered. So reasonable adjustments are anything then that removes those barriers that we've talked about. We've highlighted some already, to allow disabled people the best opportunity to do their jobs. So when we say about the positive effects of treatment, so for example, it could be, if we just take ADHD, for example, so somebody with ADHD would still be considered as disabled under the purposes of the Equality Act and for the purpose of making adjustments, even if they take medication which helps them to manage their symptoms. So line managers are sort of, encouraged to always consider, obviously rests with the line manager to think about what is reasonable, that definition of what's reasonable in terms of the role, the length of perhaps the person's contract, the cost of implementation, the resource and the size of the organisation, etc. But as a baseline, we always try to encourage the taking of a strengths-based approach. That's definitely kind of best practice. And really, even if you think, well, it has the sort of the legal definition been met, but even if it hasn't, can these adjustments still be fulfilled because it's going to support and benefit my employee? So adjustments themselves, might not be physical. They can fall into the following areas. So it might be about equipment. I know after my talk this morning, I'm handing over to PJ Boulderstone, who's going to be talking about scanning pens and other sort of assistive technology. So that will follow on from my talk today. It can also be about changes to working patterns. So it might be, looking at those shift patterns. Is it better for somebody to work from home or to maybe work from home part of the time, work maybe nearer to home, that kind of thing. Might be changes to the workplace. So already highlighted some of those sensory issues. You might need to think about noise, doors banging, automatic doors, perhaps instead, altered lighting, temperatures, where a person's sitting in the workplace in terms of needing a quieter office or a quieter area, that kind of thing. Also about training, so as what we're doing today, but also to educate colleagues and to help to change attitudes, obviously to break down stigma, kind of presumptions about people, and also to help the individual themselves to develop coping techniques. It might be needed to consider redeployment in some cases. So it might be about a temporary redeployment if there's a particularly difficult time that somebody's managing for whatever reason, or it could be full redeployment. So somebody needing to move to another job or another area of the business which is better suited for their skills and strengths. And then also in terms of looking at employer policies. So, again, we've got a vast audience today, but, in terms of things maybe about sort of disability leave in conjunction or in addition to sick leave, rather than triggering perhaps the absence prompts or trigger points on a policy with regard to sickness, particularly if there are regular appointments which are needed to in line with that particular condition. So it could be maybe hospital appointments or, coaching or some other support that individual is having to help them manage their condition. Okay, over the next few slides, I'm going to be presenting adjustments for different types of neurodiverse conditions. I will say at the outset, this is not obviously an exhaustive list, and it's not that every adjustment on those lists will be applicable to every individual. So just to highlight again, that there is obviously the need for individual assessment and individual the knowledge and of individual impacts for a person. So we need to tailor this to the person in front of us. But hopefully the next few slides will actually give you some sort of food for thought about supporting people with different neurodiverse difficulties. So in terms of dyslexia, so I've taken this from the British Dyslexia Association website. Dyslexia is obviously the having a difficulty with reading and with grammar, accurate sort of fluent word reading, and it can be difficulties with what's termed sort of phonological, so kind of sound kind of awareness, verbal memory, and verbal processing speed. So it's worth noting as well that 60%, according to their website, 60% of people with dyslexia will also have difficulties with maths. So again, there's that kind of overlap between conditions. So we've got some suggestions here to help with reading. I'm not going to go through all of them, but you can see there's a number of ways of highlighting and pulling out different points for people in documents or in memos, that kind of thing. There's the use of different assistive technologies, different software that is available, different recorders, etc. And then some practical things such as, using somebody that hasn't got dyslexia, for example, to take the minutes of meetings, etc. There might be things to do in terms of the workplace itself to aid concentration. So thinking about the quiet space, a private workspace, maybe the use of a do not disturb sign, etc. And then some things to actually do with regards to managing computer screens and glare, the amount of time that somebody is sat and working at a computer, that kind of thing. Okay, so there will be some overlap between these conditions. So moving on to dyspraxia. So this is from this Dyspraxia Foundation. So again, different areas here. So people with dyspraxia typically have following difficulties. So it's going to be things like operating computers or office machinery. It might be difficulty with keyboard skills, organizing their workload, communication, such as following oral instructions and taking part in discussions. Maybe particularly with their handwriting and general writing skills, and memory and concentration potentially. So again, these are different adjustments that can be put in place to help in terms of managing their time more successfully. So lots more about kind of planning and helping to prioritize tasks. The organization, ordering of workload and workflow, so breaking down of things, chunking work, chunking things into sort of a start, a middle and an end, so it doesn't feel overwhelming. Things about how to, again, practical, quite sort of common sense things, which would probably benefit the neurotypical population as well. But things such as, pinning up instructions about how to operate different machinery in the office, and having that perhaps in diagrammatic form rather than, again, further words to kind of help demonstrate how to work that. So that's some ideas and some suggestions there for adjustments relative to dyspraxia. I'm going to move on to consider Tourette's. So Tourette's, this is from Tourette's Action, so a very useful website. So maybe people are less familiar with this as a neurodiverse condition. So Tourette's, again, is a neurological condition. It causes involuntary sounds and movements called tics. And this can be particularly difficult. There's kind of one element within Tourette's syndrome called coprolalia, that's how I pronounce it, which is where the individual, it's an unconscious thing, but the individual, an involuntary thing where they're uttering, it could be obscene language or swear words. And obviously that can be particularly difficult, not just in the workplace with your co-workers, but particularly for dealing with customers, and it's a public facing role, etc. So these are some adjustments, because I think mainly the impact of Tourette's is more likely to be on the kind of the social, that they have a social impact in terms of your work, that the individual's work function and how they're perceived, how they view themselves, then how they're perceived in the workplace and by customers. So there's something kind of the idea of maybe having like tick breaks. So as somebody might have a cigarette break, typically, actually enabling somebody to go out and try to sort of help allow them to have more of those tics and to sort of get it out of their system at more regular kind of intervals. Maybe thinking about the removal, if there's anything that's, the individual recognises that is helping to sort of exacerbate or trigger them in the work environment. Might be something quite obvious, such as needing to use more medication throughout the day. And then some of those more social impacts. So, it could be embarrassing or difficult for the individual who's got Tourette's to be viewed by co-workers whilst they're kind of managing that. Equally, it may be disturbing and upsetting or distracting for individuals trying to do their work as well. So maybe think about open plan offices or having the individual, maybe just kind of screened away or kind of, supported to have that privacy. And then some other some other adjustments with regards to kind of social impact, really. So depending on what the type of Tourette's and what the tic is. So maybe if it's more of an involuntary movement rather than the uttering of words, it could be that the individual carries a card, has a letter from the company. So if they are dealing with the public, so to explain that this is part of a condition and this is what it's about. Again, it might be depending on the role and the extent of the Tourette's, it might be necessary to transfer that person to a non-public facing position. But again, thinking about much more sort of education, understanding, and hopefully acceptance of that condition by co-workers. So again, you can see it's all very much about the need to sort of break down stigma and have better education and understanding. Okay, move on to dyscalculia. This is taken from lexic.com. So probably the easiest way to describe dyscalculia is, whereas with dyslexia that impacts the areas of the brain related to reading, dyscalculia affects those areas that handle maths and number related skills and understanding. Symptoms of this typically would arise in childhood, but adults may have this without actually knowing it. And again, linking back to the sort of later diagnosis as well. So again, you can see on this list of adjustments, again, there's some things about different software, some equipment, so different sort of calculators, different apps, having tools with pre-measured guides, so we don't have to get into more, needing to find the numbers or think about the numbers of the individual themselves, making use of things which are much more kind of automated, things which are, set up in advance. So if there's, frequently dialed numbers, etc., that these things are put in place to help minimize the individual needing to kind of think about and plan for that themselves. Some of it also might be, again, overlapping with other conditions. So needing a quieter space to work, or for focus work, this is the task at hand at a particular time, or maybe needing to do this from home for a particular amount of time, this is an aspect of one's role, additional time to complete tasks, etc. So hopefully again that's given some food for thought with regards to helping to put some things in to help individuals with this type of condition. Moving on then to ADHD. So this is taken from the ADHD Foundation. ADHD has got 3 core symptoms which affect people with it to varying degrees. So they are inattention, impulsiveness, and hyperactivity. So the inattention bit, you know, can lead to difficulties with concentration, short-term memory, working memory, difficulties with planning and getting started, sort of like an activation to actually do work, difficulty with organisation of tasks, losing things and being easily distracted. So some of the adjustments that are suggested here very much focus on that. So it's about how to increase that focus and aid somebody's attention, and also how to help them organise their workplace and their workflow as well. So again, you can see there's some different ideas here about technology, you know, making use of reminders, reviews, you know, putting in different software, creating lists, making, you know, things sort of into chunks, maybe making more use of templates for, you know, if you've got a regular report style or regular letters, regular, you know, projects that need to be reported on in a certain way, that they can be kind of given a template to do that, to make that, to bring somebody's attention in and to help them focus. In terms of the hyperactivity component, you know, that typically is more prevalent in childhood, but adults can still have symptoms of that, such as restlessness, and the kind of the need to sort of tap or the need to kind of fidget and move. So again, thinking of adjustments for that, it might be that there's a certain amount of time that the individual can cope and can kind of manage it and sit, but then they actually need to get up, they need to walk around, they need to kind of be on the move to sort of dispel some of that energy, some of that restlessness. If they need to sit at a desk, or, you know, whatever the role is, perhaps, you know, they could be standing up, but they might still need to have something like a fidget. So I use the word toy. I'm not infantilizing anybody here, but something to help them actually dispense that kind of that restlessness and that activity. And I think I'll just put in here a point as well that hyperactivity, so that ADHD, it can be sort of diagnosed differently in between men and women, or girls and boys. So there's more kind of increased recognition of women being diagnosed with this in later life now, because typically the hyperactivity bit, which comes to the attention of schools, and unfortunately is often seen as somebody being naughty, but at least it does get recognised. It seems that girls or women manage that differently, or maybe not impacted in it by that in the same way. So it's you know, sometimes it leads to that being missed in childhood, and then hence being diagnosed as an adult later on. And also, just as an extra point about ADHD, that whilst it's not a core symptom, many people with ADHD have problems with sleep. And this can obviously then have a knock-on kind of effect or a consequence for getting up and into work the next day, potential, you know, tiredness, etc., from following on from that as well. Okay, so we'll talk now about autistic spectrum disorder. I know I've mentioned that already. That was the example I gave earlier on in the talk. But obviously, you know, autism, as these conditions, all of these conditions are, you know, it's a lifelong condition. Autism will impact how the person perceives the world and how they interact with other people. So often, you know, again, I'm not going to often people with autism will see this as part of their identity. So it's not about curing the person, it's about kind of supporting and helping to manage those particular difficulties. So the ones that we've kind of noted, that the areas of difficulty that an employee may typically have are likely to fall into sensory overload, the management of their workload, communication with other members of staff, and the organisation of their work. So thinking of adjustments then for those particular aspects, we've talked about some of the sensory overload things you need to look out for. So anything that's going to help kind of reduce that overstimulation. So it could be about noise cancelling headphones, screen filters, being in a quieter part of the workplace, maybe needing flexible hours to suit the body clock of that individual. then using, I think perhaps the most important thing might be a workplace mentor. So this is very much about the social and communication kind of side of work as well. And it might seem perhaps a bit peculiar to somebody who's neurotypical, but if you're autistic and having difficulty kind of reading the social rules, understanding the kind of the communication and the sort of setting of maybe boundaries, what's acceptable to talk about, how do you, what's banter in an office place compared to what's a conversation, or what's a meeting kind of conversation. So things can be different. There's different rules that we don't explicitly make clear when you go into a workplace. So a mentor can be really helpful in talking the specifics through of that, and what's kind of appropriate, what's expected in certain forums, basically. So yeah, much more about the kind of the social side of that. There might be, again, if depending on how, because individuals are have individual difference, how impacted and affected somebody is, there may be the need to exempt or give permission to kind of exempt that individual from social gatherings, or perhaps particular team meetings, or even particularly from meeting clients face to face if that's particularly difficult. The other aspects here are very much more about the organisation of work and managing workload. So some of it's fairly kind of obvious about writing down things, being really clear and giving short, understandable, explicit instructions, putting things into smaller components, and perhaps using apps and, again, sort of computer-based programs to help manage somebody's time better, and breaking things, project work, perhaps down into smaller chunks. Okay, so I hope that's given you an overview of different adjustments, or a bit of a whistle-stop tour, as it were, to some ideas to help people with different types of neurodiversity. I'm sure you're obviously already aware, but I'm just going to point out the Access to Work grant as well. So, the government enabled grant that's accessible by an individual if the workplace is not able to provide sufficient support. So Access to Work, can pay for different equipment. It can provide practical help at work, help with perhaps getting to and from work, assistance to develop a support plan, and they also work with the employer to advise them how to best support the individual in the workplace as well. So yeah, that's accessible through the government website there. Okay, so coming near to the end of the presentation now. So just in terms of, really trying to embrace this, and again, think about what else can we put in place, and what else can we use to really genuinely embrace a neurodiverse friendly workplace. So this is going to mainly be through training and information events, I would suggest. So, it's very much about raising awareness of neurodiversity. So hopefully this webinar today has given you some further information, some further insights, further ideas, hopefully. It is about having an inclusive culture and fostering that from the top down in any organisation. I just bring your attention to the National Autistic Society. So they have a sort of a standard, a bit like a charter mark, as it were, sort of autism friendly award. So if, as an employer, if you kind of work towards that standard, it's a way of demonstrating to your staff, but also to your customers, and I guess to future staff as well, that your organisation offers an industry approved autism friendly environments. That's a really good thing to kind of have under your belt as well. Hopefully today I've made the case about recognising individual strengths, and different conditions come with kind of strengths and weaknesses, but people with the same condition will still be different to each other as well. So it is about recognising that and making the most of that. It's very much about, trying to encourage openness, disclosure of conditions, and only by doing that, and alongside that, reducing stigma. So making that more the norm, to kind of be open and offer support and adjustments to help with that. Also helping the individual themselves to develop those coping strategies. I mentioned about the neurodiverse kind of network. So, you know, if you have kind of neurodiversity champions or a support network in your workplaces as well, again, it's about that lived experience and sort of influencing things from the grassroots up, as it were. So these are all ways in which to, you know, to sort of get this more into place in the workplace and really embrace this. Okay, just bring your attention to a couple of resources here as well. So in addition to those other websites that I mentioned on each of the conditions. So we've got the CIPD, there's a CIPD website, CIPD document related to neurodiversity. As I said, the National Autistic Society is phenomenal with the information that they provide. There's also ADHD UK, they do a welfare pack. And I'll just bring your attention to, there was perhaps some viewers, individuals have already seen this, but there was a recent BBC Two programme about autism, Inside Our Autistic Minds, where Chris Packham, who's autistic himself, interviewed a number of individuals, and that was a really, I think it was a very good, a very sort of insightful eye-opener into that world as well. So that's currently available on iPlayer. Okay, so we're coming to the end of my section. I'm understanding when we're saying for questions, the way we're going to do this today is to take any questions in the chat, and then to respond at the end of the webinar. Over the next day or two, there will be email replies to those questions.